Another 2 questions from my nearly infinite number of questions here at the Q&A. This is part 3 of the second Q&A session I've done 2016, coming to you from the charming town of Kunming, Yunnan, China. Of these 2 questions, the second one is directly related to veganism, the first one not so much. So I have a question here from Laura D., who asks about the profound differences between Asian and Western culture. Her interest is in Japan more than China. I've done a lot of research on Japan in the last year too. Lately, I'm doing China again. And she is asking, does it help to know particular philosophical works, so written philosophy, in understanding the underpinnings of an Asian culture, such as Japan or China? Now, I'm in a position to speak on this, both in terms of Buddhist philosophy and modern Western philosophy and political philosophy. And the big problem you run into here is really self-deception on the part of the interpreter, which is a huge, huge problem. It is incredibly easy for a modern interpreter to encounter something in society and convince himself or convince herself that they're seeing the influence of some idea in an ancient book, whether it's a Taoist philosopher or a Confucian philosopher or a Buddhist philosopher, what have you. There's a sort of self-hypnosis that goes on when Westerners start with a piece of ancient philosophical text and then go out looking for its affirmation in modern society. I've seen this thousands of times. And it's a peculiar sort of ego trip, right? Because the person doing that analysis, they're really convincing themselves that they know better than all the members of the culture surrounding them, whether that's China or Laos or what have you. And this skips the hard work of looking at all the intermediary stages for how a philosophy becomes known or influential in a society in the real world. So to give you an example, when I lived in Laos, Laos is both a Buddhist country and a communist country. And I really did research into what was the living culture of both communism and Buddhism. So, to give you an example, how does anyone in Laos know anything about Buddhist philosophy? Well, I actually went to the college where the Buddhist monks are educated, the elite Buddhist monks. Not all of the Buddhist monks go to college. And I looked at the actual textbooks that were used to teach Buddhist monks there. Now, at that time, the main textbook still being used to teach, Laotian monks what Buddhism was in Laos was written by a Frenchman. It was written by Louis Finot. So this isn't just Western influence. This is Western influence at quite a profound level. And I note also that this was my theory at the time. The cover of the book, and it was mostly, again, Laos is a really poor country, or it was then. They were using photocopies of this book, not real printed copies. And what they used for a cover, Louis Finot's name was almost invisible. And the name of the translator, who was Lao, was quite large and prominent. So I think the vast majority of people studying it, they didn't realize the author was French. They didn't realize this was Western influence. So, there you're looking at a great example of how, it might be easy to imagine, this philosophy from 2,500 years ago directly influences people. No, philosophy from 2,500 years ago, as reinterpreted by a Frenchman 100 years ago, as translated and adapted into Lao, some number of years ago, as photocopied, as taught in the classroom in this government-run institution. That's what influences people. And even that's at an elite level. And then you can look at folklore, stories, what's actually taught in school curriculum, how people actually get to know this stuff. Of course, you can look at things like TV and movies. In a country like China, the main way people here get familiar with Buddhist philosophy is probably through kung fu movies, which is the same in New York City. Wu-Tang, the rap group, their main contact with Buddhist philosophy was through kung fu movies. It's the same for a lot of people in the modern world within Asia. You can't presume that people are directly influenced by some ancient fragment of text. How are people in England today influenced by Plato or Aristotle? First of all, if English is your first language, you might say, well, not at all. The influence of Plato and Aristotle is very tiny. But then if you actually think about it, you can dig into how are these things taught, how do these ideas reach the public, and maybe there still is some influence of Plato and Aristotle on British society that that we can detect or we can talk about. But actually looking at all those intermediate stages is really difficult. And in doing that work, you gain a really rich and profound appreciation for how the whole society operates and the limited role that philosophy, textual philosophy, plays. Now, to give another example, okay, I'll stick with Laos. I knew a lot about communism before I ever went to Laos, both in terms of study and otherwise. In Laos, the government system, the government education system, does teach all the school children about communism, but what they actually learn is very different from what you or I might think communism is. One of the first shocks, so Karl Marx is one person, Lenin is another person, and a standard term in communism is Marxist-Leninism. That's a school of philosophy within communism. Well, this was so poorly translated into modern Lao that the vast majority of people I met in Laos, they thought that Lenin-Marx was one person, because they hyphenated it, Lenin-Marx, as one man. They thought that was one man's name. And even out of the history of their own country, there were other examples of that, where there were two different communist rebel leaders, Ong Keo and Kamadi, and they thought that was one guy. They thought that was one long name for one person. It was two different historical figures. So that, this is me as an outsider. I'm doing research into the history of communism in this country, and including communist ideology, and also the effects communism had on Buddhism, because the government regulates the religion there. And right away, I'm learning things that the vast majority of people in that country are not learning in school. And then again, you can look at it at an elite level. What about the tiny minority of people in Laos who do go through, a university education in communism, and how do they influence society or not? You can look at the newspapers. What do the newspapers say about communism, or the radio programs within a country like that? And how do people actually relate to this philosophy? Now, communism is not as ancient as Aristotle. It's not as ancient as Plato. It's not as ancient as Buddhism or Confucianism or what have you. But still, the connection between philosophy and culture is so distant and so thin and so weak that you just can't let yourself get into that ego trip of wandering around a country with a book of ancient philosophy in your hand and out of your own imagination identifying things that you feel resonate in the modern world with the ancient philosophy. Now, I've seen that go very far wrong in China and also in Cambodia and elsewhere. Sometimes, like in Buddhism, we know that a certain idea only became influential after 1875. There's some particular year in the 19th century when new translations and new publications selected an idea from the ancient world and made it popular and influential again, and it hadn't been before that. And, you get Europeans talking about this stuff as if there was an ancient continuity, that Buddhist philosophy had never changed in Asia. And that's not true. I mean, it's true. I mean, even with Christian philosophy, how is Christianity different today from 1950, from 1850, from 1750? Actually, if you're going to do the research, there are tremendous differences, philosophically, politically, and otherwise. Some of them explicitly articulated as philosophy, and some of them implicit and unexamined. So there's a really subtle sort of ego trip that tends to warp the way people perceive the significance of philosophy in the modern world. And I say, even in politics, that significance can be very slippery, very hard to grasp, very hard to define. And you have to look at all the intermediate stages of how that gets redefined and shared and understood in society as it actually exists. End of answer to that question, I guess. I have another interesting question or comment from Virginia R. So Virginia is commenting on and questioning about something that's been brought up a few different times in my Patreon group. It's been mentioned on this YouTube channel not too long ago. The weakness of arguments from evolution anthropology, claiming that human beings are naturally evolved to be vegan based on the shape of our jaw, of our teeth, the nature of our digestive tract, and what have you. Now, so I agree with Virginia, or Virginia was writing in agreeing with me, that these are weak arguments for veganism. However, there's a difference between weak and evil. In my earlier video, I think the one showing you film footage of me walking through the streets of Kunming while I talk about this stuff, you got to remember, this doesn't discredit veganism. It's okay to play around with these ideas. It's okay to discuss them with your friends. If you have friends who find them interesting, in talking about veganism, you can talk about it. I would not make it part of the constitution of a vegan party. I would not make it part of my platform I'm trying to convince the public of. I mean, I even feel that way about the cancer statistics. I would never say like the strong argument for veganism is based on a certain percentage difference in the rate of cancer. But it's interesting, and it's fine to play with. It's fine to discuss with your friends. So I think, the weakness of the argument is worth thinking about. I mean, I just mentioned within the mammal kingdom, why do pigs have such tremendously powerful jaws? It's quite frightening how powerful a pig's jaw is in the wild. A wild pig, a wild boar. Well, for one thing, it's because they don't have any hands to use to manipulate things. So they have to be able to crack open a coconut, crack open, both animal and vegetable matter with their jaw alone, without being able to use hands or tools or what have you. And you can see that kind of massive, powerful jaw, with some other animals, human beings are an extreme example where we can use our hands and we can use tools to break food into pieces or to accomplish other tasks. Then we rely less on the sheer power of our jaw to do things. So as a broad pattern, some anthropologists argue that the withering away of the human jaw in relatively recent evolutionary time reflects the fact that in comparison to some of our most ancient ancestors, we rely less on cracking things open with our teeth. So is this really an argument for veganism, or does this just reflect, the type of jaw we have? Does it just reflect the type of hand we have and the overall sort of synergy that exists within evolution, anthropological adaptation, and what have you? The difference, though, is this doesn't discredit veganism, this idea. If you find it interesting to talk about anthropology and evolution, if you're in a circle of people who find this interesting or rewarding to reflect on, fine, do it. If you're in a circle of people who are really interested in cancer research, I'd say fine, do it. You want to talk about veganism and cancer. I can imagine someone having a whole YouTube channel just devoted to the latest cancer research. I can imagine someone having that as a hobby or, of course, as the profession if they're a medical doctor. There's nothing wrong with that. But, I would never have a street protest. I would never march down the street holding a poster saying, "Don't you realize this is the anatomy of your jaw? This is the structure of the bones in your jaw. Therefore, you should be vegan." To me, that's not the basis for a public protest or for a political movement. It's just not strong enough for that. And likewise, the stuff with cancer, I think it's important and it's interesting. And again, you can play with it. It doesn't discredit veganism in any way. But again, I would not have a poster on the street saying, "Don't you realize you can reduce your chances of getting cancer by this percentage in this many years?" It's just not that strong. It's not as strong as the ethical core or the ecological core of what we're doing here in veganism. Now, the problem is, sorry, I'm still sick, I'm still coughing. I still look exhausted, but that's cool. Many of the things that people have been presenting as the core of veganism, many of the things people have been arguing for, do discredit veganism. And I've complained about that on this channel at great length. So again, if you're putting into categories, there are arguments for veganism that are strong and crucial and central and part of the core of veganism. There are things that are not as central, that are a bit weaker, still interesting, still fun to play with. But there's a category of things that actually do discredit us, that make us sound insane, that are self-contradictory, that are hypocritical, or that set up standards for us we can't possibly maintain. Like, I've raised this issue. I've been one of the only channels wanting to talk in a down-to-earth way about killing insects. To say, look, killing insects, killing rats, I don't see any point in making the premise of veganism a kind of perfect moral purity, a religious moral purity, like the Jain religion in India, or some forms of Buddhism, where I don't see any point in being in denial about the fact that modern agriculture, including vegan agriculture, raising food, raising fruit, raising grains, that type of farming does kill insects. It does kill many mammals too, mammals like gophers and groundhogs. That yes, although we're trying to minimize harm to animals, we could have a down-to-earth, pragmatic attitude towards the reality of the harm we do. We should appreciate the difference we can make, and we should be honest about the difference we can make. So, whether it's the lifestyle activism, whether it's some of the, bikini and bicycle activism, whether it's the pseudoscience of, trying to present veganism as a almost, religious diet based on the belief that garlic contains a neurotoxin. I myself am a caffeine avoider. I'm against caffeine, but I don't exaggerate the negative impacts of caffeine. I recognize that millions of people manage their caffeine in their lives, but still, I don't advise using caffeine. I advise people not to use it. Pseudoscience, fad diets, extreme political views of different kinds. There are so many things that do discredit veganism that we need to exclude in that third category. But there's a broad middle category of things that where I can say, go ahead, have fun with it. If you personally find evolutionary theory fascinating, okay. And you may have a circle of friends who find it fascinating. You may be at a school where there are other students who are really interested in theories of evolution and human adaptation, where this gets results. But no. That's not what the protest march is going to be based on. And if you're going to start a vegan foundation, I do not think that's what the Constitution of the Foundation should be based on. Okay, guys, another 2 questions in under 20 minutes.